It begins where history forgets to look, where names are erased and only whispers remain. You think you know the world you live in? The stories told in classrooms, the legends repeated around dinner tables. But buried beneath all that comfort is a truth so disfigured, so quietly monstrous, that it makes you question what it really means to be human. These are not tales of ghosts or creatures in the dark. They are the echoes of people, flesh and blood. People who walked this earth, spoke the same language, breathed the same air, and did things that defy understanding. Tonight, we reopen the sealed vault of human history, the 15 most chilling and sinister cases ever recorded. Each one, a reflection of how far the human mind can descend when morality collapses and obsession becomes scripture. The first story takes us to a quiet village in the 19th century, where the church bells once tolled for salvation, but instead rang over a field of buried secrets. A local pastor, celebrated for his virtue, preached about purity and redemption. Behind the wooden doors of his chapel, however, he built something else, a private congregation of believers who worshipped him, not God. He convinced families that sin could be cleansed through sacrifice of the impure. Over 15 years, children vanished, never reported missing, because their parents believed they were being taken to heaven. When the truth finally surfaced, investigators uncovered a network of tunnels beneath the church. The walls were lined with crude carvings, verses rewritten in the pastor's own hand, and hundreds of small bones stacked like relics. He had built his own paradise beneath the floorboards, one corpse at a time. The village was erased from maps. Locals moved away. But if you walk the countryside today, you'll still find the ruins of a church that shouldn't exist. And if you listen close, you can hear the faint ringing of a bell that was never taken down. 15 stories like this one. 15 reasons history tried to forget itself. And by the end, you'll understand why some archives are kept sealed. Not for protection, but for mercy. The second case is one that still stains the soil of America's forgotten Midwest. A small town swallowed by cornfields, where the air once smelled of iron and grain and death. The locals called it the Silent Farm. For decades it stood empty, fenced off by barbed wire, surrounded by signs warning trespassers to stay away. But what they were really keeping out wasn't curiosity, it was memory. In 1924, the Wilcox family moved into that farm. A husband, a wife, and their 2 daughters. They were known for keeping to themselves, but strange rumors followed them. Lights flickering in the fields at night, the sound of crying carried by the wind, and an awful stench that seemed to seep through the soil every spring. The father claimed it was fertilizer, but the town's dogs wouldn't go near the property. When the drought came, the Wilcox family vanished. No goodbye, no forwarding address. The farm was abandoned until years later, a new owner bought the land. He began to dig a new well, and what he unearthed would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in rural history. Beneath the topsoil lay a pit of decomposed remains. Some human, some animal, some impossible to identify. But each corpse had one thing in common: they were all missing their faces. The skin peeled away, methodically, as if collected. Investigators searched the house. In the attic, they found a collection of masks, crafted from dried skin, shaped and painted with uncanny precision. Each one bore a childlike smile. Inside a locked trunk was a journal written by the mother, detailing her belief that the human soul could be preserved through the likeness of the flesh. Experts today still debate what drove them: religious delusion, psychological decay, or something older, an ancient ritual carried into modern America under a different name. What's certain is that no one ever saw the Wilcox family again. The land was condemned, but trespassers still sneak in, drawn by the whispers. Some claim that if you stand in the center of the field at night, you'll hear someone breathing behind you, slow, steady, waiting. But when you turn, there's no one there. Only the masks hanging from the rafters swaying in the dark. The third case is older, so old it barely survives in record. passed down only in fragments of rumor and local folklore. It begins in the Appalachian Mountains during the early 1800s, in a settlement so isolated that outsiders called it the hollow that time forgot. For decades, no census takers, no lawmen, and no travelers dared to enter. Yet, somehow, they survived, generation after generation, without ever leaving the valley. When explorers finally reached the place in 1872, what they found defied explanation. The people of the hollow spoke a dialect no one recognized. Their eyes were pale as milk, their skin paper, white from living in darkness. And their family trees, when traced, revealed no branching, no newcomers. They had married only among themselves for over a century. At first, the researchers thought it was just isolation, a tragic accident of geography. But what they discovered next suggested something far more deliberate. The Hollow's founder, a preacher named Elias Cray, had broken from the church long ago, claiming that the purest blood was the key to divine perfection. He led his followers deep into the mountains, convincing them that the outside world had fallen to corruption. He promised that if they kept their blood untainted, God himself would return to them. When the descendants were examined, the physical mutations were grotesque. Elongated limbs, distorted features, a strange translucence in the skin. But it wasn't only their bodies that were changed. It was their minds. Visitors reported that the children of the Hollow spoke in unison, finished each other's sentences, and reacted as though connected by some unseen thread. One man described it as a hive mind, human yet not. By the early 1900s, a government team sealed off the valley entirely. The remaining families were relocated, but official documents on the case were lost or destroyed. Some say the government feared the genetic findings would cause public panic. Others say something else was discovered, something not meant for science to study. To this day, hunters and hikers still claim to hear chanting in that part of the mountains. Soft voices rising from underground caves. And if you listen long enough, they say the echoes start to sound familiar, like your own voice calling back to you. The fourth story takes us to Louisiana, 1911, to a mansion that once stood as the pride of the French Quarter, dripping with elegance and wrought in equal measure. Its owner, Madame Clarice Duval, was a widow of immense wealth and eccentric taste. She hosted lavish gatherings attended by the city's elite, where the champagne flowed like water and the candlelight never seemed to go out. But what no one knew then was that beneath her silks and perfume, Madame Duval carried an obsession darker than death itself. She was terrified of decay, not the decay of things, but of the human body. Friends said she never allowed mirrors in her home after midnight, claiming that glass reflected the moment the soul began to spoil. Servants whispered that she slept not in her bedroom, but in the family mausoleum surrounded by the preserved corpses of her ancestors. And when her beauty began to fade, she sought a way to stop time. In her private chambers, police later discovered a collection of bottles, dozens of them, filled with what appeared to be blood. Some labeled in French, others simply marked with initials. But it was the hidden basement that revealed the true horror. There, in perfect rows, lay the bodies of her servants. Each dressed in finery, their faces painted, their eyes wide open, preserved with strange oils and herbs, their expressions frozen in eternal obedience. According to records, Madame Duval believed she could absorb youth through ritual renewal, a process involving transfusion, candlelight, and whispered prayers to what she called La Mémoire sans mort, the mother without death. The ritual demanded living blood, drawn from those who served her. Neighbors began reporting screams in the night. But by the time authorities raided the estate, she was gone. The doors were locked from the inside, the fires still burning, and in the center of the great hall, a chair. On it sat her final creation, a wax figure of herself, draped in lace, smiling faintly. The real Madame Duval was never found. For decades, locals claimed to see her silhouette in the mansion's windows, moving between the rooms as if hosting invisible guests. Even after the house burned down in 1947, The stories persisted. Some say her ashes mixed with the city's soil, and that every now and then, in the thick Louisiana heat, you can still smell her perfume. Sweet, heavy, and unmistakably human. The fifth case comes from the cold heart of New England, a story that was almost erased by those who lived through it. They called it the House of Still Voices. The structure still stands, though barely, on the outskirts of a town that refuses to put its name on the map. It's said that during winter, when snow buries the old foundations, you can still see the roofline peeking through the drifts like a grave gasping for air. The story begins in 1899, when the Garrison family moved into the estate. Charles and Edith Garrison, a couple known for their wealth and silence, rarely left the house after dark. Townsfolk remembered them as polite but distant. Two figures always dressed in black, as if mourning something long buried. Within a year of their arrival, strange things began to happen. The local children who wandered near the property would go missing for days, only to return with no memory of where they'd been. When investigators finally entered the home, they found that every room was lined with mirrors, hundreds of them, floor to ceiling. But the strangest thing wasn't the mirrors themselves, it was what they reflected. The rooms seemed wrong. Angles that bent where they shouldn't. Faces appearing that weren't present. In some reflections, the furniture was missing entirely, replaced by shadowed figures staring outward, motionless. In the attic, police discovered a hidden chamber. It was perfectly circular, with a single chair in the center and a mirror that didn't reflect anything at all. Etched into its frame was a phrase, "Do not die. We listen." The Garrisons were found there. Both of them seated, both staring into that mirror. Their eyes were wide open, their expressions peaceful, as though they had been waiting for something. No wounds, no poison, no sign of struggle. The coroner recorded their deaths as unexplained paralysis, but locals had their own version. They said the Garrisons had discovered how to trap voices, how to capture echoes of the dead through mirrors polished with silver and blood. Even now, people claim that when the wind cuts across the old property, you can hear whispers drifting through the glass. They say the Garrisons' voices still linger, faint, pleading, trapped forever between reflection and reality. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you face what your family left behind, or seal the mirrors and never look again? The sixth story is not one of ghosts or curses. It's worse, because this one is true, documented in court records and medical journals, though most were quietly removed from public view. It happened in 1957 in a small Midwestern town that prided itself on its hospital, St. Aurelia's home for the convalescent. It was meant to be a place of healing where the elderly and forgotten could find dignity in their final days. Instead, it became a place where mercy turned into madness. The head nurse, Evelyn Hart, was a woman of precision, pale, proper, almost machine-like in her devotion to order. She believed suffering was unholy, that pain corrupted the soul before it could meet God. Her obsession began when one of her patients, a dying priest, whispered something to her on his deathbed. The body is the first lie. From that moment, she began her own crusade. At first, she only administered what she called silent medicine, a mixture of morphine and air, meant to help patients cross peacefully. But soon, her definition of peace expanded. She selected those she believed were closest to grace, those with pure minds or kind hearts. One by one, they died quietly in their beds, hands folded, lips faintly smiling. It took nearly 2 years before anyone noticed the pattern. When police finally exhumed the bodies, they found traces of air embolisms, deliberate, efficient, and untraceable by ordinary means. But what they discovered in her quarters was far worse. Hidden beneath her bed were dozens of cassette tapes, recordings of her sessions. In each, she spoke softly, coaxing her victims into acceptance, repeating the same line again and again, "You're almost home. Just breathe once more." Between the pauses, faint voices could be heard responding. Not pleading, not afraid, just whispering her name. Evelyn, Evelyn, Evelyn. When she was finally caught, she didn't resist. She smiled. "They're waiting for me," she said. "They're not dead. They're only sleeping." And no one knows what happened to the tapes. The hospital burned down a year later, under suspicious circumstances. Locals say sometimes, when you pass the ruins, you can hear faint breathing in the cold air, like someone just took one last breath and never exhaled. The final case is not bound to one place, one name, or one moment in history. It's a pattern, a shape that repeats itself across generations, changing faces but never truly dying. Historians call it the vanishing line, but those who've studied it longer call it the blood script. It began with a diary found in the ruins of a burned down home in Virginia, dated 1813. Inside, a single phrase was written hundreds of times: "The debt must return to its maker." Over the next century, similar diaries would surface, in Ohio, in Kansas, in Montana, each written by different hands, each describing the same nightmare. A visitor, a stranger who arrives during storms, always polite, always smiling, always asking for entry. Those who let him in, families mostly, vanished within days. But the houses remained pristine. Dinners half-eaten, fires still burning. The only thing left behind was a new diary, freshly inked, beginning the same way. "I've seen his face. I understand now." By the 1940s, folklorists believed it to be nothing more than hysteria, a shared myth passed through stories of isolation and fear. But declassified files from the 1960s suggest otherwise. Government agents investigated a series of disappearances across rural towns that all shared one detail: a man in an old-fashioned suit, described as courteous and hollow-eyed, seen walking alone before each incident. One survivor, a child at the time, recalled his voices. "You called for history. I came. No one knows what he is. A curse, a man, a mirror of what humanity hides from itself. But wherever he goes, silence follows. Entire bloodlines vanish. Records erased. Graves unearthed. It's as if he collects the memory of those who dared to remember what should have been forgotten." They say, if you dig too deeply into history's forbidden corners, you begin to draw his attention. Because the past isn't gone. It's patient. Watching, waiting for someone to open the right door or speak the wrong name. So if you've made it this far, maybe you've already heard him. The knock that comes when you're alone. The voice behind your own thoughts, whispering just one question. The same one he's asked for 200 years. "Do you remember me?" And if you do, you'd better pray history forgets you back.